2024 National African American History Month is an annual celebration of achievements by Black Americans and a time for recognizing the central role of African Americans in United States history. Coatesville. The lynching of Zachariah Walker was not simply a singular incident in a singular town. Rather, it begins to tell the larger story of American history in the early 1900s, according to one local historian. As a people, in many ways, we have had to overcome atrocious acts. Walker was burned to death by an angry mob 100 years ago. Dennis Downey, a history professor at Millersville University and author of 2 books on Walker, said the story of Coatesville is about more than Coatesville, a booming steel town at the time. Coatesville can be used to tell the story of American industry and progress and all of the social tensions that become woven into the larger American story. Coatesville was a particular place in a particular town, and the story has its own features. Yet, if you are willing to connect the dots, you will see a much larger narrative that was included in much of the American history of the early 20th century. As the steel industry in Coatesville began to grow, Europeans and Black American Southerners flocked to the city looking for work. In the case of Blacks, an escape from Jim Crow laws. The outsiders often lived outside of the city in parts of East Fallowfield, Callan, and Valley Township, while the established residents lived within the city limits. Despite being in different parts of town, there was some tension and resentment among lifelong residents towards outsiders. Immigration can set up the stage for tension, and that's also the background story of Coatesville. Walker was one of the outsiders who moved into the city looking for work in the steel plants. He was a laborer in his early 20s who was searching for prosperity. In searching for prosperity, he left his wife and children in Virginia. Beyond the basics, not much about Walker is known by anyone according to Downey. On August 21st, 1911, Walker was drinking in the city and reportedly was rowdy as he walked back to his home in an area known as the Spruces in East Fallowfield. On the way, he was stopped by Edgar Rice, a steel factory guard. Rice, a white man, was a former police officer in Coatesville and a popular figure in town at the time. Belief among many in town was that Rice was one of the frontrunners to be elected as the city's new chief of police that fall. After Rice and Walker met, an altercation ensued, and Rice was shot and killed by a gun Walker had carried with him that night. Walker would later claim the shooting was in self-defense. Downey said he is in no way attempting to overlook the death of Rice or to make Walker into a virtuous hero. He said Walker did murder Rice, but nonetheless was himself a victim of a heinous crime, a hate crime. Once word of Rice's death spread throughout Coatesville, a search team was dispatched to find and capture Walker. On the morning of August 13, 1911, Walker was found hiding in a tree by the search team. He eventually fell out of the tree and suffered injuries that admitted him to Coatesville Hospital. As police arrested Walker and cuffed him to the hospital bed, emotions began to run high through the city among the residents who wanted to avenge the death of their beloved former police officer. That evening, a crowd gathered outside the hospital. Eventually, 1 or 2 dozen people worked their way inside the hospital in an orderly and purposeful fashion. Then Walker was dragged from the hospital bed to a farm about a quarter of a mile outside of the city in East Fallowfield, where he was lynched. A lynching is defined as a death committed by a mob without legal authority. While lynchings were often done by hanging, it was not always the case. Walker was placed on a pile of burning wood. as hundreds gathered to watch his death. Walker attempted to, numerous times escape, but was pushed back into the blaze, each time by the crowd. The next morning, people searched through the ashes for Walker's body parts as souvenirs. There was a bit of a carnival scene, but this was very deliberate action, as lynchings always were. Burnings were grotesque. They were a grotesque spectacle. Rummaging for souvenirs was not uncommon. This really does fit the model. After the lynching came months of trials for 15 men and boys who were charged for the death of Walker. All 15 were eventually found not guilty. Downey said it was clear from his research that jurors were not going to find these men guilty. He said the minds were already made up long before the trial began. There was an unwillingness to convict these men. While public sentiment was that this was appalling, there was a resistance to conviction. That doesn't mean they supported the lynching. In some respects, Coatesville is still, in the long aftermath, still struggling to deal with this event 100 years later. May God bless the individuals and victims of any hate crime.